Pam, is that something Melissa can help with? Okay, yeah, I can hear the static too, even all the way over here. Okay. Well, the static's gone anyway. Can you hear what I'm saying? Do you hear me? Yeah. Are these those things at the door, Pam? I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about administrative things because we've got a lot, I think, to do. What I'm hoping to get through Roman times and maybe into the early Middle Ages today, and then we will do the late medieval period and the Renaissance, the burnings and all that, and then forward through to modern Wicca, 20th century and 21st century Magick, and maybe a few predictions for the future next session, in time for Halloween. I would point out that it's probably fitting that we're starting today. It is Friday the 13th. So if you're superstitious, here we go. Another point, so some people have noticed, Magick is spelled with a K. That is not just a lighthearted throwback to Elizabethan spelling, but it was a proposal which I've adopted in the 20th century. It was a proposal that Magick with a K is to differentiate from magic without it. Magic without it is stage magic. It is illusions, stage illusions, what Blackstone and all of those guys do, which is great stuff, but is not what we do, not what this history is about. Magic with a K is the people intend to be altering or predicting the physical universe. They're making stuff move, they're predicting the future, they are doing something. So when you see those words, you now know the difference, and now you'll see it all the time because it pops up on the television and magazines and so forth. So you'll see that happen a lot. Always with these history courses, I have an issue, and that is, do I do strictly chronological order, or do I violate chronological order in order to tell a story and finish the story even though it goes out of the period? I do both. Sometimes I wait for the end of the story. Sometimes I finish the story. I'm afraid I'm not consistent on that, but I try to do what I think will be clearest. So you all can let me know if different ones were not clear, or if you really wish you had the end of that story ahead of time or whatever. As I say, you're guinea pigs, and I really would appreciate your thoughts. I also want to point out that what's included in Magick changes over time. What was magic at one time simply becomes technology at a later time. In fact, I was saying to Melissa when we were going before, this is of course is a great illustration of Arthur Clarke's third law. Arthur Clarke, the science fiction writer, his third law states that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you think about it, you can do all of the things that, say, the Greek gods aspired to do, we can do. But we do it in a technological way, and we don't think of them as magic. So what does magic include at a particular time? Well, let me draw to your attention, perhaps, if you think with, say, a prehistorical mentality to the extent you can, cast your minds back to the good old days, you know, and think about a genie, a spirit, that is, a magician, a sufficiently skilled magician, can conjure out of nothing with a ritual involving sticks and an incantation. Once materialized, this spirit eats, it breathes, it grows, it jumps, it looks and behaves like an animal. It can also shrink and die. When it's alive and well, it can jump through the air and devour everything in its path. It's dangerous. In fact, working with it is very useful, but if it gets out of control, it's a major disaster. Does anybody know what my genie is? Fire. If you think about it, what is fire to an ancient society? If you start talking to them about a world in which there are atoms and molecules and unseen germs and cells floating around in the air, they're going to look at you like you're a man from Mars. They're going to say you're nuts. Nobody would believe that stuff. Tell that story to some idiot. Of course we can see that fire is a spirit. It's alive. And of course we can see that the magician conjures it with two sticks out of nothing. Now, looking at this problem, fire eventually becomes used by everybody, not just the magician. Every housewife, every hunter learned how to conjure his own fire. Use it in the kitchen every day. It became mundane, but they still didn't have any idea what it was. And many people continued to think of it as magic, as some kind of a creature. The other proposal, which really didn't develop until the Greeks insisted on being systematic and wanted rational explanations for everything. Not that their rationality necessarily was what we would accept today, but they wanted it to be internally consistent. So all they could do was give it a name and call it an element. They had 4 elements, 5 if you count ether, earth, air, fire, and water. But they didn't go any further to explain what it was, what it did, how it did it. That didn't happen until the 1800s, that late. And for all of that period of time, nobody really knew what fire was. It was magic. Let's go back to really one of, in the West, and by the way, this is a history of Western magic. I had to draw the line somewhere. We're not doing East Asia, we're not doing Indian magic, we're just sticking with the West. So let's start where the West begins, with ancient Egypt. We get most of our information, of course, about the people in power, and the guy in power in ancient Egypt was Pharaoh. If you look at what Pharaoh did and what Pharaoh was supposed to do, Pharaoh was a magician. Pharaoh did magic. Pharaoh was responsible for doing rituals daily to make the sun rise. Pharaoh was responsible for doing rituals yearly to make the Nile inundations happen, and not just happen, but happen within controllable limits. More importantly, perhaps in the life of an Egyptian farmer, Nile inundation, do you know, maybe I better go back. Nile inundation, the Nile overflows its banks, or at that time did, until the Aswan Dam. The Nile would overflow its banks once a year and drop silt all through the Nile Valley, which made Egypt the rich farmland that it was, and the envy of practically everyone, every other community in the whole Western world. But you paid a price for that. For 3 months out of the year, your fields were flooded with water. The Nile rising was between 25 and 45 feet. You had to leave and take your animals with you. And it was very important to know when this was going to happen so that you could bug out at the appropriate time, and then also know when to get back so that you could sow your crops and do your thing. How is a body to know? The Egyptian priests, because they had been around for so long, Egyptian society lasted for a very long period of time, and it learned the art of writing. So it had written records that went back literally hundreds of years. Very few people had that. It found a correlation between the heliacal rising of the star Sirius and the beginning of Nile inundation. So the priests, who were astronomers, when Sirius rose, put out the warning to all of the temples in Egypt that it was time to be ready for the Nile rising. This was obviously magic. The principle grew up that the heavens and the earth were connected, that as above, so below. What went on in the heavens predicted what went on below. So the star rises, we get the flood. It's obvious, right? The Egyptians went a little further. With all of their astronomy and watching the stars, they noticed that in the course of a night, the stars circle. And you only see, of course, half of it because the sun is up the other half and you're missing a bit. But in the course of a year, you see it all. They sectioned the sky into 360 portions, little segments. We still do today. We call them degrees, right? All of that dreadful math that you had to do in high school with circles sectioned into degrees. The Egyptians, however, sectioned them off into groups of 10 fingers on hands. And they grouped them then into 36 groups of 10, which we now call decans. And they made an annual calendar based on the decans, which had a convenient number of days, 360, plus 5 additional days tacked on the end. Thank you. Note to self, have water, don't croak. The Egyptians did not have a couple of things. Oh, by the way, one thing that I do, when I do all my classes, I wear a hat that's appropriate to the class. So I should put my hat on today. This is the one for today. The Egyptian calendar did not have leap years. They did figure out that eventually that leap year was needed, but they didn't have it when they set up the civil calendar. So that meant that every 4 years, New Year's Day wandered off another day. So New Year's started in March, but during the course of a cycle of 1,461 years, it moved to each day of the year and then eventually cycled back to the beginning. Within a human lifetime, however, and remember, lifetimes were shorter. It didn't move all that much, and so, it was good enough for government work, right? But you still needed the priests to watch those stars and tell you when the flood was going to start. An interesting correlation, though, and date, is that the Egyptian civil calendar's New Year's Day correlated with the rising of Sirius once every 1461 years. It correlated in the year 2781 BC, which many people have proposed as the beginning, probably when they created the basis for the Egyptian calendar. That's how old Egyptian society is. Egyptian society was already old and gone at the time of Christ. It was already more than 2,000 years old at that point and had been taken over by other people. Now it appears also that Pharaoh's claim to power as a magician with power over the sun and the flood and the climate, was a result of the way that Egypt began. The Egyptian people originally lived farther west in the area that's now the Sahara Desert. Climate change gradually dried that out, and it became pretty unlivable. It also dried out the Nile Basin to the point that humans could actually live in it if they could maneuver around the inundation problem. So the Egyptians moved in there, and Pharaoh claimed the power to prevent further climate change, provided he did the proper magical rituals, daily, yearly, and so forth. Pharaoh obviously needed help. The Egyptian priesthood were basically sub-magicians that were delegated to do the rituals for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh himself, of course, was thought of as a god. The priests generally did not have that honor. I would point out that Sirius, the rising of Sirius, no longer predicts Nile inundation. There is a wobble in the Earth's orbit called precession that moves gradually and slowly, moves events, stellar events, away from their original position in the solar year, so that the rising of Sirius no longer occurs in the spring to early summer. It's now in August. It has wobbled that far out of alignment and is no longer good for the purpose. In addition, the Aswan Dam was built by Nasser in the 20th century, and basically the damming of the water and then allowing the water to flow through slowly has eliminated the Nile inundation for most of Egypt. So Egyptians aren't running back and forth with all their animals anymore. They don't have to do that, so long as the dam continues to be there. But if somebody blows it up, they have a problem. This is the Egyptian god of magic, Heka. Heka was interesting because Heka was thought of as being the basic substrate of the entire universe. The universe was based on magic, not on technology, not on mechanics, but on magic. The rest of the gods, Ra, the sun, all of the rest of it came after Heka. Heka was the fundamental substrate on which all ran. And it was the god's purpose, including Pharaoh, to promote Ma'at, order, strict order. The Egyptians figured that having escaped the Sahara, they had it good in the Nile Valley, and they wanted nothing to change, ever. The Egyptian mentality was, don't mess with a good thing. Leave it alone. In addition, since all the world was fundamentally based on magic, everything that everyone did every day was based on magic. The housewife in her kitchen was based on magic. She was, in a small way, a magician. The reason that bread rose or didn't, that beer fermented or didn't, that wounds healed or festered, all of the different things that could happen in the course of a day was a result of magic. So the housewife would accompany everything she did with an incantation. She would cast a spell, and if she did it well, it worked. And if she did it badly, the bread didn't rise or whatever. If you tried to suggest a world in which there were tiny little yeast beasties running around in the atmosphere, they'd look at you like you were nuts. If you think about it, that's a very logical conclusion on their part. Pharaoh's ceremonies, rituals, and the way that all of the Egyptian gods were worshipped, in one way or another, was that they were held to live and inhabit usually a statue placed in the inner sanctum of a temple. This is a picture of a temple. I think it says up there. Yes, it does. This is to Isis, the Egyptian goddess Isis. Egyptians thought of Isis as the goddess that used magic. Not all the gods were particularly magic users, but Isis was. The reason was because her husband had been killed by his brother, and her brother too, by the way. She married her brother. Incest was not a big deal, was required. But Isis, according to the story, took the dismembered pieces of her husband, pasted them all back together again, borrowed the word of power, the fundamental magical principle on which daily life was based, managed to charm that out of Ra, who told her, and put her husband back together again. Osiris then became the god of the underworld. Magic. And way back in the back there, you can just see the pedestal on which Isis' statue would have been placed, and the priests only went into the statue, into the inner sanctum. They would go in, they would wake the god, they would feed the god, they would clean the god, they would sing songs to the god. And when their rituals were finished, they would clean up after themselves and would sweep away even the footprints of them off the sand on the floor so that no one could see that they'd ever been there. They were extremely clean. Cleanliness was a huge thing for the Egyptians. By the way, Pharaoh was completely shaved, bald, all hair, all body hair shaved off, which is why he wore the wigs and so on and so forth. He had no hair at all. Notice, by the way, the correspondence with the, since we're talking in this environment in particular, with the Jewish Old Temple, the inner sanctum, the worshiping of God, but not with a statue, because the Hebraic custom made a big deal about not having statues to the gods. But there was still an inner sanctum. It was still only priests were allowed there, not the public, and so forth. Why was that? Moses was trained as an Egyptian priest. Moses was an Egyptian priest and an Egyptian nobleman. The Hebrew ceremonies and celebrations had a direct correspondence with the magic that was inherent in the Egyptian, and that magic was passed along to subsequent religions. So beware that you're going to see things that you've seen before. This is an image of Isis leading one of the queens through the underworld. Remember, Isis's husband Osiris, when patched back together, becomes the king of the underworld. You needed magic spells in order to get through the underworld, to ward off evil. Of course, you didn't want to do all the work for yourself. The point of going to the underworld and so forth was not to get a better life, what was to continue the wonderful life that you already had on earth. It was a continuation, not an improvement. So you had to take your servants with you. They did not, however, normally kill servants to have them go along. They took little models, statuettes called Oshebti. And there were magical spells in the Book of the Dead for making the Oshebti come to life and then be your servant. And so when the gods required you to do some task for them, you didn't do it yourself. You sent your Oshebti, of course, the same way that you would have done in real life as an aristocrat on earth. Now, ISIS's cult spread throughout the Middle East. It spread to Asia, to the Asian Middle East too. And we're going to see a little bit more when we get there about some of what was going on over there. Before I leave, I want to talk about two particularly notable Egyptian priests and their skills that were considered magical. One was Imhotep. Imhotep was an official of the pharaoh Djoser, early, 2670 BC. So shortly after that date, when the calendar and the rising of Sirius coincided, this would have been in roughly the same time period, about 100 years later. We're talking a very long time ago. Imhotep is recorded as the guy who figured out how to make pyramids was by piling these huge blocks on top of each other. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, if you think about it, how do you do it in such a way that these bricks don't crumble with the weight of what's on top of it? And while we're in the neighborhood, how many bricks do you need to make each one of these layers? The number system at the time was not like ours. They had no zero. There was no place holding. Numbers were made up. You've all worked with Roman numerals, right? A Roman numeral would stand for a number, so I stands for 1, V stands for 5. If you want to write 100, it's a C. You want to write 1,000, it's an M. Try doing addition with that stuff. More importantly, try doing multiplication and division with that stuff. You can't. They had to hire an expert, a priest, to do multiplication and division on an abacus, because there was no way they could use their own number notation for everyday people to do multiplication and division. It couldn't be done. The Egyptians collected a few formulas, mathematical formulas, one of them being literally how to figure out how many bricks you need for a given block, a given rectangle. Another is how to figure out how many loaves of bread you need for a particular workforce. They collected a few of these very practical math, and they were regarded as incantations. They were regarded as magic. They were known and defended by the priests that operated them in the same way that the principles of astronomy were defended. Now, while we're on the subject of the astronomy, let me also point out that the general principle, as above, so below, if that could predict Nile inundations, surely it could also predict the fate of the dynasty. If you could interpret it correctly, the position of the planets, the position of the stars, could presumably tell you whether the dynasty was going to rise or fall. Could tell you the future health of the pharaoh. Maybe could even tell you the future health of aristocrats, if they were important enough. And at a later period, maybe even of common people. And that's exactly the progression over the course of about 1,500 years that went on in Egypt. And we got astrology. It was done empirically. They wrote down what was the position of the stars, what was the position of everything when certain events took place. They took note of it, and when they saw that again, they said, oh, well, look what's going to happen. This is what the stars looked like, and this is what happened when they looked that way. It was entirely empirical, just like science, but it's what we would today call magic. The other, I jumped too fast. The other chap that I wanted to point out, the priest that I wanted to point out in Egyptian history, just briefly, was Thoth. Thoth we mostly think of as an Egyptian god, but Thoth was probably a retainer, a vizier or a court official for one of those early pharaohs. He is given credit for figuring out the writing system, the hieroglyphic writing system, and the method of recording that made all of this possible, because the guts of Egyptian magic was recording events over very long periods of time. And the power to do that was entirely due to the writing system. And the power to remember mathematical formulas was entirely due to the ability to record them in the writing system. So Thoth was rewarded by being regarded as a god. Notice, by the way, that magic in Egypt is generally sort of friendly, at most neutral. You use magic to help you. You could run around using it to hurt people, and indeed the Egyptians thought not necessarily that you would be punished for it at that time, but that you wouldn't be allowed, if you had any pretensions of being allowed to, in the afterlife, to go to a good place, you had to go through a test, and the test was you had to swear that you were free of guilt. And your heart would then be measured to see if you swore true. And if your heart was heavier than a feather, you lied. And if you lied, your soul would be fed to the crocodiles. But if you told true that you had not done anything bad with magic, well, then you could go to the pleasure fields and live just the life that you'd been living, the pleasurable life that you'd been living on earth. And everything would remain the same. The key to Egyptian is everything remains the same. In the Near East, this is not a very, let's see if I can get that to spread down. Rotten picture, I apologize. In Asia, the gods in the Near Eastern kingdoms in Asia were not viewed as friendly, were not even viewed as neutral. They were viewed as being hostile. One needed magic not to help them through a bright and sunny future, but to protect you from imminent disaster. You were always at the mercy of whatever bad was coming your way. An entirely different worldview. This picture, which I apologize, you can't see them very well, is the Sumerian god Lilitu, which became Lilith in Hebrew terminology. A pretty lady with claws on her feet. She was thought to visit humans in the nighttime, to murder women and children, and to suck the blood of men to get their strength and power. And most of the gods of this period, they had storm gods, they had all sorts of nasty creatures running around, and almost all of them were ill-disposed towards humanity. Magic was used every day, but strictly for protection. The law on magic was a little confused, at least from this distance. This is a stele that sets out Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi was the ruler of Babylon and the Babylonian Empire. His dates are officially 1792 to 1750 BC, before Christ. That's a very long time ago. Notice we are 1,000 years more modern than the Egyptian dates that I was giving you. Gives you an idea of the sweep of time here. This stele was only discovered in 1901. They learned to read cuneiform writing. They can actually read this thing. I can't, but they can. Experts can. And it is a law code. It really is not a code so much as a series of individual judgments given at court that were just concatenated together. The interesting thing for our purposes is that rule number 2 has to do with witchcraft. Rule number 2 provides, in essence, that if someone is accused of witchcraft without proof, that the defendant has the right to free themselves of the charge by jumping in the holy river and showing that they don't drown. If the holy river drowns them, then they're guilty, and the accuser will take their house. If they do not drown, then they are innocent, and they get to take the accuser's house. And it is unclear because in most of the code, if you wrongly accuse somebody of a capital crime and lose the case, the accuser is killed. One or the other is going to be executed. So you had to be careful about the cases you bring, not a litigious society like ours. Rule number 3 of Hammurabi's code dealt with the general court procedure, and it is unclear whether that applied in witchcraft trials as well, or whether rule number 2, the special procedure, was the only thing that applied. That's interesting because rule number 2, it was the defendant's obligation to go forward. You might almost say guilty unless proven innocent. Rule number 3, the general rule in Hammurabi's courts, though, was the one we are used to. The accuser had to go forward. The accuser had to prove the case innocent until proven guilty. It is unclear at this distance how the two rules work together. I have no doubt that there were probably lawyers arguing the case both ways at the time. The Middle East also looked at the stars. They were very interested in the stars, and they also subscribed to the Egyptian principle, as above, so below. This is a tablet basically of omens, a record of individual omens. Encapsulated within it is some 21 years of history of the positions of the planet Venus. So it's called the Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa. It was a Babylonian tablet. However, a lot of the Babylonian names for the stars turned out to have been carried over from Sumerian names from the prior society. So the archaeologists and whatnot have deduced It was probably the Sumerians that began this, and it was simply carried over. As above, so below. It started out that individual city-states in the Near East were identified with particular stars. As those stars became ascendant, their city-states would grow and thrive. As they were dominated by other stars, it was regarded that they would lose, and so forth. As above, so below. And that would also apply to their individual rulers, and eventually to their citizens, and the same progression as in Egypt to aristocrats and eventually even common people. 1,000 years after this tablet, they were beginning in the 5th century BC to apply it to more or less regular people, people with at least enough wealth that they could buy a horoscope. It was the Near East folks that came to dividing the heavens into the 12 that we know today, the 12 zodiac symbols. Now, an interesting corollary to what was going on with the city-states and as above, so below, is that the Near East thought that they could find evidence of good or bad reflected. If it's reflected in the stars, then it must be reflected on other things here below, including the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly their liver. So if you dedicated a sacrificial animal to a particular course of action, sacrificed it, and then examined its innards, and found that it had a spot on a particular portion of its liver, that would give an adept magician warning that when to do the thing, don't do it on those days, or when to do it, how to do it, and so forth. This is a clay model of a sheep's liver that has been turned into sections, and each one of those sections is annotated in cuneiform writing with what it stands for. If you have a blemish in this particular segment, this is what it means. There weren't just one of these. This was widespread. This particular one was Babylonian, but we've found dozens of them, especially in the Assyrian areas. They really went in for this. They really believed it. Notice it's just a working out of that principle, as above, so below. It's logical. Not something I would care to duplicate, however. When we think of Near East magic, who do we usually think of? We don't think of the Egyptians. We don't tend to think of the Babylonians. Who do we think of, especially at Christmas time? The wise men from the East, right? The Magi. This is a Byzantine mosaic of the 3 wise men coming from the East. The Phrygian caps and the particular outfit, the leggings and so forth, identify them as Magi. Who were the Magi? The Magi were apparently a special tribe that came under the sway of the Persian Empire. They were united into it by Cyrus the Great. They claimed not just the ability to follow the stars, but also an entire religious outlook that stemmed from a prophet, a religious figure called Zoroaster, and the Zoroastrian tradition. Now notice that the Egyptians had an afterlife, and in the Middle East they had sort of an afterlife, but they were kind of gray and neutral, and the Egyptians wanted just to be left alone to go on doing what they were doing, and The Babylonians wanted to go on and just not be eaten by the gods. But Zoroaster proposed that there was actually a fight going on earth and in heaven between good and evil. And there was a good God and there was an evil God. And they had people that were their children and, hangers-ons and so forth, sort of like angels and like that. And that this was what was really going on in the world. This dichotomy between good and evil did not exist, apparently, in ancient religions like the religion of the Hebrews, until they came in contact with Zoroastrianism. When did they do that? The Babylonian captivity. When their aristocracy was hauled off to Babylon as prisoners. Eventually, the Persians captured Babylon. The Jewish community made up to the new rulers. They weren't dumb. They got in good with Cyrus, and Cyrus eventually not only allowed them, they were clever enough to incorporate a lot of his state Zoroastrian religion into Jewish rituals and so forth, including the idea of the war between good and evil. But they also were able to keep their reference to the one God. Now, the Zoroastrians had problems because they believed that the one good God, Ahura Mazda they called him, was supposed to be the God of all. So they have the problem, where does evil come from? Same problem that the Hebrews had and the Christians have, and so on and so forth. And they came out with various solutions, philosophical stuff that I'm not going to bother with us today. But the very same debates, the very same questions, the very same arguments, and the very same solutions that were adopted by Hebrews and Christians and also by Islam were being thought through and argued and worked at by the Zoroastrians, and apparently were transmitted to the Hebrews while they were in Babylon, and then transmitted by the Hebrews to the other religions of the book. So we owe a lot to the Zoroastrian tradition, a lot more than we probably think we do. I should also mention that Zoroastrianism was the other major religion in the Near East and an opponent of Christianity, and it remained so, the dominant religion in the area, until the advent of Islam in the 600s AD, so a very long period of time. I find interesting, many people have argued that Zoroaster must have just a little bit predated Cyrus and the Persian Empire. Other people have examined the holy Zoroastrian writings and said, no, these are from a much older time period. They go back a long way. The debate was pretty well resolved in the 1990s by some Russian archaeologists who were doing excavations at a place called Gonartepe, which is in Turkey. And they found there that in the period of the 2nd millennium BC, there were fire altars, and Zoroastrian tradition was fire was the principal cleansing thing, and fire altars were a hallmark of the Zoroastrian faith. So it now appears that Zoroaster was probably a contemporary of about the same time Hammurabi was writing his code, and was a lot older than people had originally thought. It's interesting what comes out of modern archaeology. Anyway, the wise men from the east were almost certainly Zoroastrian priests. They were interested in astronomy. They were in Babylon with Cyrus when he took over Babylon. They acquired the records that the Babylonians and the Sumerians had acquired, like that Table of Venus, and they added it to their tradition, and they became in ancient terms, are quite noted for their ability to use astrology to predict outcomes. I've talked a bit, I've kind of jousted with the Hebraic problem, but let's hit it head on. Hebraic law, Moses' codes, Exodus, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That's King James Version translation, I would point out. Actually, the original Hebrew word was a kashaf. And there's some debate as to what the devil a kashaf might have been. The Latin translation looked at it and said, well, in Hebrew it really has the connotation not of an everyday magician, not of a housewife casting spells to make bread rise, but of somebody who actively works through demons, is a consorter with bad folk, bad spirits. And so the Latin Vulgate used the word maleficos, which has a similar connotation in Latin. When it came time for translation to English, the proposal was made that this should be called wizard. Thou shalt not suffer a wizard to live. However, this was in the late 1500s, early 1600s. King James II was the new king of England. He'd been around in Scotland for a while, and he regarded witches and witchcraft as a particular area of expertise of his. He wrote a book on the subject. And so he prevailed upon the translators, who were, after all, translating the book in his name, the King James Version, to change the word and use witch. And that's how that phrase came to be. It is an artifact of translation, and you need to be a little careful at what's going on. Now, Mosaic law does not have this phrase just in Exodus, but it recurs. It's in Deuteronomy, it's in a number of other places. And there is endless debate among biblical scholars, which I will not go through here because it would be a yawn session. But there's endless debate over exactly what it did mean. The kings of Israel did use certain magical techniques. They consulted certain oracles. They consulted something called Urim, which people now think were flat rocks that were inscribed like dice. So like you cast the shells or the bones, where you cast these Urim and then had a priest interpret what it meant. They were very interested in dreams. Moses himself was a magician, flat out. Moses goes with his brother Aaron and Aaron's rod, which is a magic wand, of course. They visit Pharaoh's court and they conduct magic. They threaten them with the plagues of Egypt. They cause them to happen by magic. When the Exodus happens, they raise the pillar of fire by magic. Moses parts the Red Sea by magic. He causes manna and water to appear in the desert. He strikes the rock and the water appears. The manna comes from heaven. How? By magic. He wins over the Amalekites because during the battle, the Bible story says if his arms are up, we're winning. If his arms are down, we're losing. He's a very old man. He can't keep his arms up. So they had to get the advisors on either side, the courtiers, to keep his arms up so that they would win the battle. magic. Moses was a flat-out magician, and not just any magician, he was an Egyptian magician, an Egyptian court-trained priest and magician, done in Egyptian style with a rod. A cobra-headed rod, according to the story in the Bible, just as the Egyptian pharaoh's court magicians had cobra-headed rods. Solomon, the great king of Israel, noted for wisdom, says the Bible. A magician, says the Talmud. A magician, says the Quran. A magician, says almost all of Middle Eastern culture and history. Power over beasts, power over winds, consorter with jinns to build the great temple. Now, at this date, one might question what that meant with modern skepticism and scientific skepticism over such things, but at least they thought so. A magician. Solomon was thought to have left a book of spells and abilities to communicate with spirits. It has been called the Key of Solomon because of the legal status of communicating with spirits. People have not been too anxious for many centuries to admit that they had such a thing. But it eventually appears in writing by the Renaissance. And, you can get copies. There are various old copies of this thing. There is one online, by the way, dating from the 1200s, that you can, if you read ancient Hebrew, you can be my guest, read it right off. Just don't ask me to correct your grammar, because I can't. King Saul. This was the guy that David took the throne from. King Saul, when he has an impending battle with the Philistines during the rebellion, he wants to know how it's going to come out. He consults dreams. He consults the Urim. He doesn't get satisfactory answers. He wants to know. His priest, Samuel, has recently died. So he goes and he visits a necromancer to raise Samuel from the dead so that he can ask Samuel who's going to win the battle. In the King James Version, what does that necromancer get called? King James strikes again, the Witch of Endor. But it was actually a necromancer of Endor. Samuel, by the way, tells Saul that he's going to lose. He fights anyway. He loses anyway. He's killed. All of his sons, I believe but one, are killed as well. Sort of an act of bravery, I guess. Time moves on for us as well, and so I want to move forward to ancient Greece. I mentioned earlier that the Greeks have a reputation of being rationalists. They are only in a limited sense. They wanted some internal consistency with their stories. They wanted some internal consistency with their mathematics. But they were not rational in the sense that we think of rational. They weren't looking, they were looking for answers from thought, answers from reason, not necessarily from observation. The Odyssey presents an interesting series of conundra as to what Greek society thought was legitimate and what was not. So Circe and Aeolus could use magic to raise winds to help Odysseus. No objection. But when there's also, by the way, no objection to necromancy. Odysseus raises Tiresias from the dead to give him a prophecy in much the same way that Saul raises Samuel. No objection. However, Circe's turning humans into pigs in order to keep them basically imprisoned, that is objected to by the god Hermes. That's regarded as illegitimate. Now, there's been a lot of debate as to what the principles involved are, but you can play with that yourself. But some magic was good, some magic was not, and evil magic was not, whatever would be considered evil. The Greeks were very big on oracles, the best known, of course, being the oracle at Delphi, where usually female priests were asked questions about what was going to happen in the future, and they would predict, often in Delphic terms, in rather ambiguous terms, as to what was going on. The popular story about this is that Croesus, the king of Lydia, when faced with the rise of the Persian Empire on his borders, went and had somebody ask the oracle at Delphi, should I invade Persia and stop this? And the answer came back, if you invade Persia, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus invaded. He did destroy a great empire, his own. Persia won. The answers were often ambiguous. One of the most influential Greek thinkers, I'm going to deal with two of them as we get, but the first one I want to talk about is Pythagoras. Pythagoras started a school. It was an ascetic lifestyle. It was in southern Italy, by the way. All of southern Italy were Greek colonies and had Greek culture. Pythagoras discovered a lot of mathematical stuff because Pythagoras had the theory that the universe ran on mathematics, that it was all about math. Most of you were plagued with the Pythagorean theorem in high school. We will not do it again. One of the big things that I think is worth talking about is Pythagorean music. Our theory of musical intervals stems from Pythagoras. He noted that notes that sound what we would call an octave apart, they have a symmetry to them. If you play those on a string, you get an octave apart if you stop the string at half. So the ratio of the string length between the high one and the low one is 2:1. The interval of a fifth, if you play piano, it's a C to a G on a piano. The ratio is of the high one to the low one on string length is 3:2. The interval of a fourth is 4:3. The interval of a third is 5:4, and so forth. All of the popular intervals had ratios of strings that were ratios of simple integers. Pythagoras thought the universe should work on the same principle. Again, magic. Would make magic a lot easier if it did work. Proposed musical scales that would do that. Sadly, the arithmetic itself does not work, and I don't have time to go into it, but it works for a short span like an octave, but over the course even of a piano keyboard, 88 keys, 84 keys, if you look at how a piano is organized, 7 octaves work out to be the same number of keys, 84 keys, as 12 fifths, 84 keys. But the math, if you look at the vibrations per second, does not work. The only reason it works on a piano is because the scales are fudged. They aren't actually in tune. And so they have to be wrenched out of sequence in order to make them come out even. As I say, it doesn't work. But Pythagoras thought it would work, and indeed thought it would work on a global scale. He proposed that the planetary orbits were in the same progressions as the notes of a scale, and that indeed the orbits of the planets played music as they ground around through space. And this was, of course, the famous music of the spheres. And that was a scale, a regular, a regular scale that you would hear. I will say that the astronauts have not so far been able to say that they heard it. But there you go. Now, either Pythagoras himself or one of his disciples, Philolaus of Croton was where he had his school, invented a form of mystical numerology in which you would take somebody's birthday in numbers or somebody's name. Remember that all of the Greek letters corresponded to a number. All of the Hebrew letters, by the way, correspond to a number. So when you write your name, there is a number that's implied in that. You take all of the numbers that correspond to those letters, add them up, that's your number. Philolaus, the numerology, invented a way in which you cast out certain portions of this and reduced it to a single integer number. And you could do it with either a birthday or a name, and that was your number. And then your number was read for characteristics of that number. And that they could tell you what you were going to be like, and they could tell your future. That is still practiced today. Numerology is popular with a certain group of folks, and that it still goes on today. The medicine, the additional mathematics, and all of this that the Greeks brought were mixed with the Egyptian ideas of Heka and Egyptian formulas and Egyptian medicine, and they came together in the library at Alexandria during the period of time when the generals of Alexander the Great ruled Egypt, which was for several centuries. There was a collection of books made from the 3rd century BC through the 1st century AD that basically strung together all of what was known from this period in the way of magic, and became a resource that was looked on as sort of you want to learn about magic, you go to this set of books. The legend is that this burned up when the library burned up, but that just isn't true. The original fire wasn't that bad. The books were around. They were translated into Arabic. They became known in Arabic circles. They also became known in Constantinople. There were deposits of them in Constantinople. And when Constantinople fell in 1453 AD, a long time after these were collected, these books came on the rare book market. Cosimo de' Medici, the Italian banker, bought them. Also got one of the son of one of his physicians to learn Greek so that he could translate them, and set this guy to translating this collection of magical texts that he had acquired on the market from Byzantium. In addition, he translated all of the works of Plato and all of the principal disciples of Plato. And this collection of learning went on the market and became the basis for the Renaissance, the basis for much of what happened with the revival of learning. Magick was at the core. The first thing that he printed were the Magick books. By the way, the new printing press was just out at that time, so it was a big deal. I jumped out of chronology for that because I wanted to tell the story. Let's jump back to the Greeks briefly. Their military tradition, we know a lot about it because of the writings of a guy named Xenophon, who wrote a number of books on Greek military history. The principal one is the Anabasis. It's a group of 10,000 Greek warriors went to help out a particular side in Persia, in a civil war in Persia. They chose the wrong side. They got trapped in the middle of Persia. They had to fight their way out. Xenophon managed to get himself chosen. The original generals were all killed in a treachery, and Xenophon got himself chosen as the principal general. So he was basically writing his memoirs about how I got everybody out, one of those. Interesting thing is that the way he did the politics was by interpreting his dreams. He sold them all that his dreams had told them that he was going to be their general, and they bought it. He sold the Greek army on one of the things that they were very interested in, which was examining the entrails of sacrificial animals. Remember that whole technology. That was crucial to any decision by any military commander in the field. Xenophon, in fact, records one instance in which a Spartan general who was noted, Agesilaus II, was a noted tactician of the day. He had read the auguries, had the priests do their thing, looked at the astrology, sacrificed the animals, determined that his attack on his particular enemy was a good thing to do. He sent the first wave in and it wasn't going well. He stopped. He redid the sacrifices in the middle of the battle, confirmed that he was supposed to continue the battle, sent the second wave in, and in fact won. That was how important it was considered to Greek military commanders. The world was magic, rather like the Egyptians looked at the world in their own sense. So, not so rational, these Greeks. The other Greek philosopher I wanted to point out was Plato. Plato is not heavily studied today, but he had a cosmology in which his notion was that what we see and experience and smell and hear on earth is imperfect. It moves, it dies, it decays. It ain't the real stuff, sports fans. There are ideal images out there in the heavens that are perfect, that live at the behest of the One, the perfect God in the eternal world. And that what we see and hear and smell here on earth are, in his words, like shadows thrown by a fire against the wall of a cave, where we can't see the real objects. We only see the images. This notion, this keeps wandering off, this notion of the imperfection of the earth and the point of everything being to commune ultimately with the perfect was the guts of Platonic philosophy. It was thought that when you died, the part of you that was part of the world's soul, this perfect organism, would go back to the heavens and then would have to return. Plato and his followers were big on reincarnation. You ended up having to come back. People who followed Plato didn't particularly care about magic, but people who followed Plato did. And they regarded it as the job of somebody who was sufficiently religious was to get in communication with the perfect part of the world, the heavens, all the good stuff, and shut out all of this sensory garbage that we're getting here on earth. The net result, there were various ways devised to do this. You might communicate with angels, you might try to do it directly, but if you were adept, you could. Not only that, but if you were adept enough, you were in communication with the planets, the stars, the One. And, as above, so below. If you could see what was happening in the perfect world, you would also know what was going to happen in the world that we can't see very well, the earth. And indeed, if you were very adept, you might be able to change it. You might be able to bear upon the spirits, the planets, the One, to make a different result. Magic, both divination and direct reaching in and doing something about it. Plato's followers were regarded as if you studied Plato, you were regarded as, at least in theory, going after this power. Now, we see this in Roman times. A Roman author, and again I'm going to jump out of order because I'm running out of time, but in the hundreds AD, a young Roman was coming back from school in Athens, where he had been studying Plato. He got sick. He hung around with one of his friends, met a young widow who was part of the family, who also, incidentally, was very wealthy. They supposedly fell in love. He married her, had all the wealth, good stuff. And the relatives sued. They accused him under Roman law of witchcraft, of sorcery. What was their proof? 2 circumstantial pieces of evidence. One, so soon after the widow became a widow, she's off, mooning after this guy. That's unnatural. And 2, he studied Plato. Therefore, he's a magician. Therefore, he's using witchcraft, sorcery, to attain his ends. I will say to his credit, the Roman judge didn't buy it. But I should also mention that in addition to studying Plato, he also studied speech. He studied elocution and made a speech in his own behalf, which he recorded, and which has survived and has come down to us to this day, in which he basically ridiculed the relatives who were attacking him in court and did a fabulous job. It's online. You can read it in translation. It's a big, hairy deal. Later in life, he wrote the only surviving complete Roman novel, which is called The Golden Ass. And it is loaded with what they believed witchcraft was in that period of time. The guts of the story is that the hero, a guy named Lucius, sees a witch, a Thessalian witch named Photis, who rubs an ointment on herself, says an incantation, turns into a bird, and flies away. The guy tries to do it himself. He thinks this is a good idea, hey, why not? Uses the wrong ointment, screws up the incantation, and turns himself into an ass. And spends the rest of the book trying to sees the world from the viewpoint of an ass, and spends the rest of the book trying to get back into human form, which at the end of the book he finally manages to do. But we get a vision of witches that we see where some things come from. The witch is shape-shifting, turning into a bird in order to fly away. No broom, mark you. But still, the ability to fly was thought to be part of the deal. The Thessalian witches. This was a reference to Thessaly, which was a northern part of Greece, and was noted socially as a place where witches came from. It probably is due to a school that was started by a woman called Aklonike. We don't know exactly when she lived, probably the 1st or 2nd century BC. She was said to have had the power to draw down the moon. We don't know exactly what that means, but you will see that phrase used in modern Wicca and witchcraft, the power to draw down the moon. It has been adopted. I will say that some of the Roman authors, in looking at her, then they wrote her up, said that actually what that means is she was able to use mathematics and astronomy to predict eclipses. And she knew when the moon was going to be eclipsed and therefore drawn down. So, you pick your own meaning. You are on your own. I told you the story about the Corpus Hermeticum and being found in the Renaissance. I'm going to skip that. Let's do quickly a few pieces about Rome. The original source of Roman law were the 12 tables. Came from antiquity. Supposedly each aristocrat had to memorize it. At least Cicero said so in his works. They do not exist anymore. Nobody knows exactly what they said, except they've been quoted in a number of pieces, so people have tried to piece them together from quotations by taking a bit here and a bit there that have been let slip. Generally speaking, there is a provision in Table 7 that says that pernicious incantations are punishable by death. What is a pernicious incantation? It does not appear that it's all incantation, because Roman society, like the Egyptians, like the Greeks, was riddled with magic. They believed in it to their core. It was the use, probably, of magic to do evil, to do bad things. It was kind of an increase to the sentence. The Lex Cornelia was another statute that was passed. This was by the dictator Sulla, who was the immediate predecessor to Julius Caesar and Pompey. He was the guy who educated them, took power, and tried to prevent anybody else from doing so. Failed, obviously. But he was a member of the Cornelian family. He passed a law, and it was against assassins and poisoners, and he included a provision against soothsayers and enchanters who used their powers for evil. It was not a general prohibition of using magical powers generally. Indeed, we know that Julius Caesar himself used magic all the time personally. He had a bad accident, for instance, getting into his litter one time, and so he had, or I believe it was his chariot, I'm sorry. And so he had a habit that he said an incantation 3 times before he got into each time before he got into his chariot, so that he wouldn't fall again, so that that wouldn't happen again. He believed in it, he used it, he did it. Soothsayers, sorcerers, home magicians, medicine. Roman generals, like their Egyptian predecessors, used sacrificial animals. They read entrails. They particularly read livers. They were very interested in what was going on. Several of the emperors made an intense study of various forms of magic, especially this sacrifice of animals. One particularly gruesome notion, again, these notions of correlations with things, Gladiators, of course, the Roman gladiators were known for supposedly their vigor and vitality, right? A lot of the the aristocratic women wanted to sleep with them because they felt that it improved their vitality in bed. One of the things that was done was that people wanted to get their blood, and they would get them when they were mortally wounded. There were vendors who would take the corpse and draw the blood and sell vials of it outside the Colosseum or wherever the games were being held. But there was one particularly nasty practice that was recorded where people, if the gladiator was wounded and dying but not yet dead, people would run in from the side with containers and catch part of their blood as they were still alive, because then it was particularly potent. A rather disgusting piece of magic. Apollonius of Tyana was a noted magician in the 1st century A.D. He was a Pythagorean. He believed in reincarnation. He thought he was a reincarnation of Pythagoras himself. He did miracles everywhere, made exotic food appear at table, rose the dead, made statues walk, all sorts of stuff. And he was taken as a bit of a hero. There we are. He was taken as a bit of a hero by a certain class of Roman aristocrat. Septimus Severus's wife actually commissioned a biography to be written of him. We have the bio. The early Christians didn't like him. Why? He was supposed to be a very moral chap, was supposed to be upright, upstanding, doing all the right things. Why didn't they like him? Because their own guy was doing the same stuff. That's why. Jesus was a magician. Jesus did magic. The miracles of Jesus are the same sorts of magical things that magicians were doing at that time in the Middle East. Making food appear, water from wine, etc., loaves and fishes, raising the dead, healing the sick. It was the same stuff. Indeed, some of the Gnostic Apocrypha say that the charges on which Jesus was crucified was in fact that he was charged with sorcery, and that's why they executed him. There was in Gnostic records supposedly a magical battle between the followers of Jesus and Simon Magus, who was the Gnostic hero, a magician, and they both vied with each other as to who could do the better magic. Magic was inherent in Christian ritual. If you think of what the Mass is doing, it is turning wine into blood. It is a transformation. It is classic magic. Yes? Probably not. As I say, Roman society was riddled with magic at all levels. And so I think it's fair to say that the betting is, as near as we can figure, that like the Greek law, if you use magic for good purposes, you're okay. It was not a crime. So therefore, in Christian, you're absolutely right. In Christian purposes, that's good use of magic, so that's good. Anybody who uses magic for any of the other faiths, that's bad. And so they would then say that's the bad stuff. Not just if you used it to kill people or make crops fail or anything, but if you used it to promote religions other than Christianity, that would be bad stuff. And hence Apollonius came to grief. because Apollonius was a supporter of the Platonic notions of life, that you use magic to try and get in contact with the greater being, magic. And so that's what they had problems with. I am out of time. I'm going to stop here. I didn't get as far as I wanted to, but we will pick it up here 2 weeks from now and go from here. But thank you very much. You've been very faithful and hung right in there. Some of this stuff isn't easy. Questions? Thoughts? Is it? Or, I mean, witches can also do good things, so that wouldn't be... that. Not necessarily. I mean, we have this... Yeah. In English, we tend to think of... We have historically not always used witches as meaning only women. In fact, many of the people who were executed in the Renaissance, which we'll get to, were men. But we have this hang-up on gender, and so we tend to talk about wizards and sorcerers being men and witches being women. But those words were not originally necessarily confined to gender meanings. A wizard is simply somebody who's wise. And, it doesn't necessarily follow. So there is no gender differentiation, really, and they're both doing the same stuff. The magic that they practice is really identical. Now, there is some thought, and we'll talk about these, the women in the covens, and the 13 women to a coven, and dancing naked and all that. The interesting thing is you're not seeing that in ancient society as witchcraft. You're seeing it in, say, the celebrations of the Bacchanalia. You're seeing them in worship of Bacchus, simply because most of the worshipers were female. But that was also attended by men. And was regarded, by the way, as a problem. The Roman Senate outlawed the Bacchanalia eventually in Italy because it was getting out of hand and really ripping things up. So they put it down. But it's interesting that if you want to find out what people are actually thinking, look at what they do, look at what they outlaw, look at what they punish, look at what their statute says.